The task ahead for Olaf Scholz might seem straightforward: keeping his job as German Chancellor. But this man has other plans. And there are 5 other politicians also hoping to triumph in the upcoming elections, following a campaign that is anything but straightforward. Who will manage to win the people's confidence? Confidence that has been lost in recent years.
Most people no longer trust politicians because they've often been deceived.
I haven't been able to explain government policy to people for a long time.
Is there anything you regret at this point?
No.
I've made some difficult decisions and they put people through a lot. There's been a loss of trust.
There are so many people wanting to become chancellor. It's crazy. They're all fantasizing about their dream job.
Running as a candidate for chancellor is an enormous step.
There's a huge challenge ahead of us, and we have to rise to it. Because if we don't, then in 4 years' time, our democracy may no longer be functional.
Germans' confidence in their government has been dwindling for some time, but it reached a low point last year. What happened in November 2024 brought about a fundamental change in the political landscape. Photographer Clemens Bielan documented a series of meetings in the Federal Chancellery between Olaf Scholz and then still Finance Minister Christian Lindner.
One evening I suggested to Chancellor Scholz that if we couldn't agree on a new economic and financial policy, if we couldn't figure out a budget together, then it was time for a new election. He asked if my Free Democratic Party would quit the coalition before the following Wednesday. I told him no.
Were things still open at that point?
From my point of view, yes, which was why I asked for the meeting. That's why I asked, when we were discussing the details of the budget, whether the rumoured exit was planned for a specific day, on this or that date. It was my attempt to bring about an understanding.
2 days later, the leaders of the government, known as the Traffic Light Coalition, due to the colours of the Social Democrats, the Greens and the Free Democrats, met for a cabinet meeting.
Right up until that Wednesday, around midday, I was still hoping that we would reach agreement. I believe that many of my minister colleagues had no feeling at all that this might be the last cabinet meeting of the coalition in that particular lineup.
Journalist Robert Pausch dug into the last days of the Traffic Light Coalition and discovered revelations that would later cause quite a stir after their publication. He found out that the Free Democrats, or FDP, had been planning to exit the coalition for weeks.
What was new to me was how actively the FDP had plotted this move. It was a deliberate, even scripted plan to break up the government. Since the end of September, the leadership of the FDP had held several meetings in various constellations and developed a plan to quit the government. It was an orchestrated move.
The leaders of the coalition held a meeting on that fateful Wednesday evening. What ensued was nothing less than a showdown.
I'm standing here outside the Chancellery, where the coalition is negotiating its future.
It's no longer a question of whether the government will collapse, but when.
Chancellor Scholz held a press conference and made the bombshell announcement.
I have asked the German president to dismiss the Minister of Finance. Too often, Christian Lindner has blocked laws on unreasonable grounds. Too often, he has engaged in petty party political tactics. Too often, he has broken my trust. Dear fellow citizens, I would have liked to have spared you this difficult decision.
Shortly after the Chancellor's announcement, Christian Lindner struck back.
His carefully prepared statement proves that Olaf Scholz was no longer interested in reaching a viable agreement, but rather in a calculated split in the coalition.
The morning after the coalition collapse, all eyes were on the leader of the opposition, Friedrich Merz. Were his party, the Christian Democratic CDU, to win the new election, he would be Chancellor.
Ladies and gentlemen, as of last night, the traffic light coalition is history. The day began yesterday with the news that Donald Trump had won the presidential election in the U.S. What does it mean that this happened to be on the same day that the government in Germany fell apart? People here are now looking at us, myself included, even more closely, and asking themselves the question, are they up to the job? Will they do a better job?
5 days after the coalition's premature end, Vice-Chancellor and Economics Minister Robert Habeck travelled to Lisbon by government airplane for a web technology conference. He had just announced his intention to be the Green Party's candidate for Chancellor. In Lisbon, he already seemed in fighting spirit and ready for the election campaign.
Start off something. Get up, straighten your back, do something, believe in the future.
His flight back to Berlin was postponed due to his brand new government plane breaking down. Habeck had to stay an extra night in Lisbon, missing important appointments in the German capital. A replacement aircraft arrived the next morning. That's messed up your schedule. You were supposed to be speaking in Berlin right now.
Right. The Chancellor is making a statement, and I was supposed to be speaking too. Annalena Baerbock will do it instead, and she'll do a great job.
Habeck's bid for the chancellorship got off to a rocky start, and his Green Party has lost considerable popular support since joining the government. Meanwhile, earlier in the fall, the far-right populist Alternative for Germany, or AfD, had made significant gains in regional state elections. Could Alice Weidel succeed in doing the same across the rest of the country? Weidel was keen for the party to put her forward as its candidate for Chancellor.
Die AfD zu entdämonisieren und ihren bürgerliches Deckmäntelchen umzuhängen. Wir bleiben dabei. Die AfD ist eine im Kern faschistische Partei.
Weidel wasted no time laying into what was left of the coalition government, as well as the opposition led by Friedrich Merz.
We want peace in Ukraine. We don't want arms deliveries, we don't want tanks, we don't want missiles. We don't want Taurus missiles for Ukraine. That would involve Germany in the war. I say to Friedrich Merz, if he really wants to supply weapons, then he can also volunteer to fight and not hand over our soldiers to this suicide mission. He should go there himself, along with Habeck, with Anton Hofreiter, with Annalena Baerbock. They should go to Ukraine themselves and leave our people and our soldiers in peace.
Sacked Finance Minister Christian Lindner was at pains to shift attention away from the coalition collapse, criticising the economic and climate policy of his former government partners.
Germany is taking a unique approach to climate and energy policy. We are the largest economy in Europe. We are abandoning nuclear energy, and yet we want to be climate neutral 5 years earlier than other European countries. I think that's a religious goal, but not a physically achievable one.
Anyone who thinks that global warming is a religious idea has not understood that it's about physics. And if Germany doesn't do its bit, Europe won't do its bit. And then, how are we supposed to go to India and Indonesia and say, guys, we have a problem, you need to stop building coal-fired power plants? They'll just look at us and say, why, when you've just ditched your climate targets?
It was now the end of November, and Christian Lindner's recent past caught up with him.
Einmal 45 Sekunden brauchte FDP-Generalsekretär Gierserei heute Vormittag, um seinen Rücktritt zu verkünden. Grund ist der brisante D-Day-Plan zum Ampelausstieg.
Darum geht es, ein internes Strategiepapier. Es spielte den Ampelausstieg detailliert durch mit Begriffen wie Feldschlacht und D-Day. D-Day steht vor allem für die Landung der Alliierten in der Normandie im Zweiten Weltkrieg.
The FDP did not pursue a plan that was aiming towards breaking up the coalition. The coverage of various indiscretions was, of course, used by our political opponents, in particular the SPD and Greens, to cast doubts on our motives.
The small town of Schmallenberg in western Germany suddenly found itself in the spotlight. Chancellor candidate Friedrich Merz was seeking the nomination as the CDU's direct candidate for the local constituency. Merz likewise poured scorn on his rivals' economic and climate policy, especially the Greens.
Heat pumps and electromobility are examples of how a misguided and messed up economic policy have driven this country into recession for the second year running. The state should not be deciding how we heat, how we drive, how we eat, how we live. It's our task as politicians simply to ensure sound, general conditions for everyone.
Friedrich Merz was selected with almost 100% support. But recent developments overshadowed his success. The revelations surrounding the FDP continued to haunt the political landscape.
What we saw with the FDP has shaken many people's confidence. It cemented the narrative that the established democratic parties are no better than the others. That's the narrative that the AfD likes to push, that the fringes like to push, that the political elite is basically deciding politics in back rooms and lying to the public. And that, of course, has shaken confidence in democracy as a whole.
The Social Democrats were struggling with their own crisis of confidence. Internal division over whether Olaf Scholz should even lead the party into the election further damaged their performance in the polls.
The damage for Olaf Scholz is that, in addition to the lack of faith that exists in the population and that can be seen in the polls, it has become clear that large parts of his own party no longer believe in this candidate for Chancellor.
There was a demand from the party's youth organization for change and also from other parts of the SPD. In the upcoming election campaign, what are you planning to change?
I don't think they meant that I should change into someone else, but that the campaign should get started, and it is.
Despite the internal discord, the party did its best to present itself as a team. While one relatively new party has a very different approach. The Sarah Wagenknecht alliance, economically left-wing but culturally conservative, is just 1 year old. At the presentation of its election campaign, it was clear that this is a party revolving around one person, its founder and leader.
Doch das wird nichts mit den alten Parteien und ihren gescheiterten Politikern, denn die hatten alle schon ihre Chance.
Asked which other party she had most in common with, the first thing Wagenknecht mentions is the AfD's migration policy.
I was one of those who said back in 2015 and 16 that this naive welcome culture would lead to enormous problems. First of all, it was considered racist to even say that there are Islamist parallel societies, that there is also a problem with radical Islamism, that there's a problem with failed integration. You weren't allowed to say any of that. And then the AfD came along and did say it and got into the Bundestag because all the other parties refused to address these issues. And now all of them, the CDU most of all, maybe not the Greens, but definitely the SPD, have also changed their tune. The question is whether people will buy that.
To many, Sarah Wagenknecht is a charismatic figure, and she's not short of autograph hunters. In its focus on a single person, the party clearly differs from its rivals.
Are we on time? Are we running late? Most people no longer trust politicians because they've often been deceived by them. This election campaign is no different. The SPD is promising to do the exact opposite of what it's always done, not credible. The CDU is promising huge tax cuts, but doesn't say how it plans to finance it. It wants to comply with the debt brake and increase armaments. It doesn't add up.
In mid-December, all the candidates were present in Parliament, the Bundestag. Chancellor Olaf Scholz had called a vote of confidence, which he expected to lose. The plan was that it would pave the way for early elections. Leading the polls, the centre-right CDU and its regional Bavarian sister party, the CSU. Alice Weidel was waiting to seize her chance. The AfD is in second place in the polls, so theoretically, power would be within her reach. But at this point, none of the other parties were prepared to form a coalition with the AfD. For the foreseeable future, Weidel knew she'd have to make do with a supporting role. Before the vote of confidence on this historic day, Scholz criticised his former finance minister Lindner for planning to deliberately break up the coalition.
Politics is not a game, ladies and gentlemen. Joining a government requires moral maturity. Anyone who joins a government bears responsibility for the whole country.
The way you addressed the FDP and Christian Lindner in particular this morning. Ah, yes, and so respectful, that response from you too. Mr. Chancellor, it's not just disrespectful, it's sheer impertinence.
If you think about why the government failed, the term vote of confidence is extremely loaded, because ultimately we had no confidence in each other. And people deserve politicians and policies they can trust.
Many people in Germany want politics to change, but you can't assume that everything will change after the election. We truly hope that the various political forces will realize that we cannot continue with the failed approaches of the past.
The real problem is that the established parties, from the right to the left, have gradually lost the confidence of the population, and that needs fixing.
December the 16th was a day of disillusionment in Berlin. The attempt to form a government with three very different partners had gone badly wrong. And the problems were mounting. Shortly before Christmas, Olaf Scholz travelled to Brussels for a European summit. Europe's heads of state and government were deeply unsettled.
Donald Trump will be back in just over 4 weeks, and with it being unclear what he wants, people here are feeling nervous.
Including Volodymyr Zelensky. Would Donald Trump as president stop supporting his country? Would he force Ukraine to capitulate? Olaf Scholz had a delicate task ahead of him, an important direct phone call with Donald Trump. It would be their second conversation since the US election in November. Could he persuade Trump to continue his support for Ukraine? The phone call with the US president-elect lasted 20 minutes. Do you know more about Donald Trump's intentions after this call?
For me, both our conversations have been very important, and also the communication between our advisors, because I can now well imagine developing a coordinated policy and approaching this as a joint task.
What was the mood like on these calls?
Both phone calls were very friendly.
After the phone call with Trump, Olaf Scholz seemed satisfied enough. Even so, the polls suggested that his chances of remaining chancellor are slim.
I'm confident about the outcome of the election. I've often observed that the last few meters are decisive, whatever the predictions. So far, I've always been successful when I've stood. Plus, it'll be February, and my greatest electoral success to date was also in February.
The next day, a murderous attack sent shockwaves through Germany. 6 people died and around 300 were injured when a car ploughed through a Christmas market in Magdeburg. At first, the motives behind the attack were unclear, but it immediately triggered a heated political debate. Olaf Scholz and opposition leader Friedrich Merz both rushed to the scene of the attack.
Such terrible events can all too easily be exploited by politicians, especially those who tend towards right-wing populism, let's say. That's why it's very telling that although this terrible attack was carried out by someone who is critical of Islam, some people are claiming that it was an Islamist attack.
Islamistischer Anschlag.
2 days after Scholz and Merz, Alice Weidel also travelled to Magdeburg. Although it had already been established that the attacker was an atheist and a critic of Islam, Weidel claimed the perpetrator was an Islamic terrorist.
Dear people of Magdeburg, we are gathered here to commemorate the victims of an act of madness. An act that exceeds what anyone here would consider possible. An act carried out by an Islamist.
That is simply a lie. It's a terrible attack carried out by someone who is profoundly disturbed.
The AfD shoehorns everything into their narrative, which cannot be rationally explained. It's their ideology, and everything that doesn't fit is made to fit.
In January, the AfD held its party conference in Riesa, Saxony. More than 10,000 protesters also turned up, delaying the start of the event. Although there had been many power struggles and leadership changes within the AfD during its 12-year history, Alice Weidel appears to have a firm grip on the party leadership.
She's like a fig leaf for this party because she's a woman, a lesbian, she has slightly darker-skinned children, and yet she still stands for the AfD. So if you accuse it of being homophobic or misogynistic or racist, it can always say, well, what about Alice Weidel?
At the party conference, Weidel's tone and choice of words were striking.
This is a clear message to the whole world. Germany's borders are closed, my friends. They are closed. And let me tell you, if it's going to be called remigration, then let's say it.
It's not just the word, but also the way it's used that reminds me of the word deportation. It's aggressive, full of hate. It exploits an existing problem to whip up anger against all people in Germany with a migration background. When I hear the word, and in that tone, it sends shivers down my spine. The next election will be in 2029, and then the next in 2033. 133 in German history was enough.
That says a lot more about Friedrich Merz and his level of education than it does about the AfD. So I won't comment.
Robert Habeck is campaigning his own way, reaching out directly to the people, visiting voters in their homes and supporting campaign volunteers in pedestrian zones.
We need to turn around this depressed, downbeat mood, always blaming others, into a more positive attitude, saying yes, there are problems, perhaps bigger than we've seen for years, but we're not giving up.
Like the others, Habeck has a strong social media presence, which helps to boost his visibility.
Can you send those photos to Max? The ones you just took with your cell phone? Let's see what they can do with them.
I'll show you the pictures I took.
Ha, funny.
Social media is playing a bigger role than ever in this election campaign. Elon Musk has been openly supporting the far-right AfD.
Elon Musk is voicing his political opinions. Fair enough. Germany will survive. But what is a problem is that he is the richest man in the world, and his assets include X. If his tweets have a lot of reach because of selective use of algorithms, and AfD content is boosted more than SPD, Greens, and CDU content, then that is a problem for our democracy.
All the candidates on the campaign trail have been making appearances in large venues. Here in Lübeck, Habeck has enlisted the support of current Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, the Greens frontrunner in the last election. Now it's Habeck's turn, here also addressing his party's rejection by the Christian Democrats.
Anyone these days who excludes certain parties from coalition negotiations is going to end up breaking a promise, or is making this country increasingly difficult to govern.
The Greens' campaign strategy is mainly a response to criticism of the Greens. Because from all sides, rightly or wrongly, they're accused of policies that don't take into account the concerns of ordinary people, that they're elitist.
The party's election campaign hadn't gone well. While Habeck got bogged down in a debate about social security contributions, the Greens were shaken by an internal scandal involving fake harassment claims against a member of parliament. Meanwhile, the AfD was becoming the CDU's main rival, and Friedrich Merz had to decide on a strategy and whether to go on the offensive. Then another attack occurred. The perpetrator, being an Afghan asylum seeker, reignited the immigration debate.
In Aschaffenburg hat es heute einen Messerangriff gegeben. 2 Menschen wurden getötet. Eines der Opfer ist ein Kleinkind.
The German chancellor does not have the same power to act in such a case the way a US president can. But our constitution means he does have an instrument at his disposal, and that is the authority to issue directives. I have decided to do something that has never been done before in the history of post-war Germany. On the first day that I am in office, if the voters in Germany agree, I will instruct the Ministry of the Interior to carry out checks at all German borders and to thwart all attempts to enter Germany illegally.
In Germany, there is the basic law, and there are treaties that EU member states have signed. So you cannot simply announce you'll implement a plan that, according to the law, you cannot do, and that could be overturned by the Constitutional Court and other courts.
Nach der tödlichen Messerattacke von Aschaffenburg ist die Migration zu einem zentralen Thema im Wahlkampf geworden. CDU-Kanzlerkandidat Merz kündigte an, seine Fraktion werde nächste Woche Gesetzesverschärfungen in den Bundestag einbringen, auch auf die Gefahr hin, dass eine Mehrheit durch die Stimmen der AfD zustande kommt.
You know what this means. Friedrich Merz is breaking the so-called firewall against the AfD.
This is the standard discussion that puts me in a situation where I am no longer allowed to do anything in the Bundestag that might have AfD support. Honestly, I don't care. Anyone who doubts my stance on the AfD should please listen to my speeches. We don't work with them, and we don't govern with them. We don't discuss joint motions with them.
A few days later in the Bundestag, a non-binding motion put forward by the CDU to toughen migration measures was passed in Parliament, thanks to backing from the AfD, who could barely believe their luck.
This is the start of a new era, right now, and we are in the forefront. The forces of the AfD.
If they gave us a majority, then that's regrettable. But no one can deny freely elected members of the Bundestag, including my group, the right to put motions to the vote that we believe in.
2 days later, his bill failed spectacularly. Friedrich Merz wanted to weaken Alice Weidel's AfD. Did his maneuver, in fact, strengthen them? The election campaign took on a completely new dynamic as the scale of the challenges awaiting the next government became clear. Immigration, the economy, climate change, failing infrastructure, and the lingering threat and fear of war. What have your biggest defeats and greatest successes been?
To me, the Russian attack on Ukraine remains the biggest challenge. It threatens the peace that has reigned in Europe for decades. It changed everything. That's the biggest problem for Germany, for Europe.
Für uns alle in Deutschland, in Europa, das große Problem.
But we did the right thing. I managed to establish a special fund for our military, and we're spending more on defense, but not neglecting what matters for the future. That's a good thing, too.
The supply of weapons to Ukraine will also be an issue for the next government, regardless of who is Chancellor.
We need a common European response. In my opinion, it would have been better from the outset if we hadn't taken our cue solely from the US, but had taken a common stance, especially with France and Britain, with regard to the supply of cruise missiles.
It's sheer madness. Russia would probably see it as a declaration of war, because these missiles have to be programmed by German soldiers. And if German soldiers program missiles that can go deep into Russia, to Moscow, or target Russian nuclear arsenals, then we're at war. I think that's completely irresponsible.
And there's yet another major challenge awaiting the next government and leader. What do you think of Donald Trump? They say he's a businessman, and so are you. Maybe there'll be some common ground there.
We do at least have the same professional experience, or let's say a similar professional background.
You weren't in real estate.
No, and I haven't done a lot that Trump has done. But we do perhaps have similar experiences outside of politics. We aren't career politicians.
What have you got in common?
Well, working professionally, everyday life, working transatlantically, working in the US. I was chairman of the supervisory board of the German branch of the largest US asset manager. I also understand the way Americans do business. That helps me to understand how Trump thinks and acts.
So you're confident that you'd get on with Trump?
I am, and we would have to.
All the candidates for Germany's leadership paid close attention to Trump's speech on his inauguration day. So what did they make of what he had to say? Were you invited?
No.
Does that bother you?
Not being invited or not being there?
Both?
Neither.
The golden age of America begins right now. I will very simply put America first.
I'm glad to hear this. It makes me proud for the United States that it now has an astute president who, above all and crucially, doesn't see the interests of Americans as secondary, but puts them first. Well, the AfD has said very clearly that it's pro-Trump, and that's why it's not a party that represents our interests, because German interests are different from U.S. interests. An AfD that runs after Trump is betraying the interests of the people here in Germany.
First, I will declare a national emergency at our southern border. All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came. And I will send troops to the southern border to repel the disastrous invasion of our country.
You would never use the word invasion, would you?
I would not, for good reason.
I suspect that if you were to ask the majority of the population in Germany, they wouldn't have a problem with this word.
Why?
Because in Germany, what with the large number of immigrants we've seen in recent years, the feeling in the cities and towns is probably closer to Trump's view than to the balanced, objective, and moderate terms used here.
Invasion is language used to describe enemies you want to beat back. He wants to send the army to deal with them.
I don't think it's wise for people who want to be in government in Germany to critique the language used by a foreign head of state in the media. Things can be quoted back to you when you're in office. And our overriding interest is to keep the relationship with the United States of America healthy and intact.
We don't get to choose our dance partners, as it were. Who governs where in the world is decided by the people there, if we're talking about democracies, and not by us.
It might get a bit wild. Not a foxtrot, but more hip-hop and rock and roll, right?
We're ready for rock and roll.
None of the candidates running for Chancellor seem intimidated by the responsibility. In fact, it's what galvanizes them. Why do you want to remain Chancellor?
I want to remain Chancellor because I want to make sure that our country remains in good shape, that we can cope with the future and we don't squabble over what needs to be done. For example, more security versus good pensions, good nursing and healthcare, more investment in infrastructure. Peace and security are central issues.
How fit are you?
I feel fit.
A simple question. Mr. Merz, why do you want to be Chancellor?
Because ultimately I feel responsible for our country. I feel I can do it, that people trust me to do it, and I don't want to shirk the responsibility. I've always said that I don't need former Chancellor written on my gravestone, but I have a duty to this country.
What should be on your gravestone?
It's not up to me.
That's your epitaph?
It's not up to me what it says.
Got it.
That's not what drives me, having this title. What drives me is wanting to improve things, seeing what we can do to make Germany better.
Who will be the next German Chancellor? Who is up to the job? It remains a question of belief and a vote of confidence.